Hello everyone, and welcome to this new video. I'm sure you weren't expecting a Skarner video from me, especially since I've never actually shown on the channel that I even play Skarner or have an interest in Skarner. But I was actually super excited when the Skarner rework was announced. I really wanted the rework to succeed, because I actually did enjoy Skarner. He wasn't the best on top lane, you would have the gimmick of pulling people under turret and that was about it. But I did like him, and I really wanted the rework to make him more viable for top lane especially. There's also gonna be some Skarner footage in the background where I play him in Master Grandmaster on top lane, so there's that as well. And I know that there are going to be some Skarner changes that are gonna happen soon. The reason I'm actually making this video is to try to give some suggestions of my own that could make Skarner better without making him more frustrating. And it might allow him again to have some build diversity, maybe even playstyle diversity, as well as allowing him to finally gain back some of its lost player base. Because after this rework, Skarner has one of the lowest pick rates in the entire game once again, just like he was pre-rework. The issue is with the kit itself, in my opinion. When his new kit got revealed, I had a lot of mixed feelings. His passive was whatever, not that big of a deal, I could see it being fine. Same for his Q and W, but his ultimate and his E, I knew instantly that both of them would be problematic. And that would be because they are super high elo skewed. Because if you gave Skarner damage, alongside the ability to go through walls, stun people up, and then get like a 3-man impale, he would be beyond disgusting. And for a while he actually was. He was super oppressive. And they had to repeatedly nerf him and cut out a ton of his damage and even some of his CC timers simply because he was too good at the high ends. Even in the average rank he wasn't doing that badly. And this all stems from his E and ultimate. They provide way too much value. And I'd say overall the rework did fail in many aspects. The balance side of it would be one, and then the other one would be his identity. Because Skarner used to be able to go attack damage, a ton of movement speed, you had people going ability power Skarner, you had people going for a bunch of haste on him, different ability max orders, and now all you do is go tank every single time. If you check any website, you're always going the exact same items no matter what. I checked like 3 or 4 different websites just to see the statistics on it. The builds are exactly the same. Whether you're in gold or in emerald or in master, it is absolutely the same. And his pick rate is the lowest in the entire game. And again, I checked multiple websites to see that this would be the case. Take a look here on OPGG. You can see the champion pick rates, and if I scroll all the way down, you can see that Skarner is the least picked champion in the entire game. Let's check League of Graphs. Let's see Skarner's popularity in silver. It is disturbingly low on his main role because he's supposed to be played in the jungle. Everyone above him is essentially on an off role. Let's look at his emerald pick rate. Once again, abysmally low. He only starts to pick up some pick rate around master, and that is because he's so high elo skewed. And even there, it still doesn't even reach 1%. Let's check on Lolalytics. Here's his pick rate in silver. Here's his pick rate in emerald. And here's his pick rate in master, where it finally isn't the lowest out of them all, but it still doesn't even reach 1%. And unlike a champion like a Mumu or Rammus who have lower pick rates in higher ranks, but at least are picked in the lower ranks like gold or silver, Skarner still keeps that abysmally low pick rate. At least the old Skarner mains had the fact that he was kind of unique, had a lot of different builds, had a unique playstyle to a certain extent, and you had a lot of build variety and build experimentation. But now it's just full tank every single time. Maybe you'll have 1 or 2 daring Skarner mains that go something like Trinity Force first or Black Cleaver first, but you can't experiment with ability power items at all, and even the bruiser items are super restricted. Because for example, Spear of Shojin doesn't give you any stacks on your Q unless you toss the final boulder, because the enhanced auto attacks don't stack it for some reason. So even on the bruiser items, there are still limitations. I know in the past, Riot actually has said that they want Skarner to just build tank items, and there were some new people that picked up Skarner that essentially told the old Skarner mains to just accept the fact that Skarner is now a tank. But let me ask something to the people that have said that Skarner should essentially just be a tank right now, no build diversity, no bruiser items, no AP items, just being a straight up tank. What if this isn't the best course of action for the character? No, really, think about it, because this is very difficult to understand. What if, and stay with me on this, what if, just perhaps, maybe a little bit, what if Riot was wrong? I'm sure they've never been wrong in the past.
Ring ring. Hello, what's that?
They're literally reverting the Gwen changes that they did 7 months ago and even apologized to the Gwen community for the changes.
Okay.
The mini rework that Gwen received was on patch 25.6, and on the same patch they had to hotfix nerf her because she was so strong. And that patch dropped 7 months ago. And during that time, Gwen has been nerfed on basically everything. And now all of this work that they put into the Gwen mini rework is completely gone because they decided, you know what, let's just revert it all. Let's just go back to what it was before we did those changes 7 months ago. It's not like we wasted so much of our time doing them, and we filled up patch slots that essentially ended up amounting to nothing. Damn, bro, they were wrong? No way. Riot's never been wrong on any balance decisions. Just look at Cassante.
How is he do more damage than me? No!
I'm sorry if this comes off as me being cocky and dismissive. A while back I made a Reddit post discussing about this exact same thing, where I gave out some suggestions for what Riot can change on Skarner and how to make him less frustrating to fight overall, while shifting towards making him more of a bruiser type champion, with a ton of build variety. And these new Skarner mains told me to just accept the fact that Skarner is a tank now and it should be this way. I'm sure the people who commented under the post about this and said this exact thing have now moved on to play something else, and Skarner's current play rate backs up my claim. But I guess it was a rookie mistake to post something on Reddit, so that's on me. I'm getting sidetracked really hard here, I'm sorry about that. Going back to why I actually made this video. The reason I made it is to just give some kit change suggestions. Not full kit changes, the abilities will still be the same, but just number adjustments with some extra things added. The main goal of these changes is to make sure Skarner isn't just a utility CC bot, and this is because if we leave him as just a CC and utility bot, he will be always pro play jailed. This is why Zack's ultimate got reverted in the tank update. When they updated Sejuani, Maokai, and Zack gained a new Q as well as a new ultimate, and they reverted his new ultimate to the old one because he would just be pro play jailed because he only really provide utility. He would jump in and kidnap someone with his ultimate, maybe an entire team, and that was really good for pro play, but then you'd have to mega nerf his numbers to make sure that he doesn't actually deal damage. So we will take away power from his E and ultimate and place it somewhere else within his kit, and also add ratios to make sure that he can now go into a bruiser style, or maybe he can even buy some ability power items, and also trying to make his kit feel a little bit smoother as well. I had other ideas for his abilities aside from the ones that I'm going to show here, but this is kind of like the final version. Before we get into the actual abilities, I did actually want to adjust some base stats that Skarner has, so I'm going to go over that as well. And the ability changes and the things that I added will be highlighted in red. First off, there's his base armor. Skarner's base armor for a bruiser slash juggernaut type champion isn't as high as it could be, so I gave it a slight buff. And his base movement speed is actually slower than a juggernaut like Darius or Set, so I wanted to buff it a bit more because I am going to take a lot of his movement speed from his kit, or just shift around how much movement speed he gains from certain things. I also thought he could use a bit more base AD, and this is because he could use an item like Sterax Gauge or Trinity Force that work off of base attack damage, and Skarner's base AD isn't that high to begin with, at least not in the later stages. And then I actually wanted to give him a buff to his mana, and this is to try to make it to where he won't need to buy Tear of the Goddess every single time for top lane. For jungle, I think this is not gonna do much, but it might make it on top lane to where he won't need to actually buy that tier, or maybe where he can take a mana flow band plus presence of mind, and that might be enough sustain on mana. You might even be able to just take the mana flow and have enough mana sustain. And I actually did lower the mana of some of his abilities, and I will explain why when we get to them. Now to get into his actual abilities. First off, there's his passive. The first thing I decided to do is make it so that his W also gives a stack of his passive. Whenever Skarner uses W, he has a chance of saying feel the threads of vibration, and that's the name of his passive. But he can't actually proc his passive with his W. So how is the enemy supposed to feel the threads of vibration when you can't even use W to proc the threads of vibration effect, huh? Then after that, I made it to where his Impale procs all 3 stacks of his passive. And this is simply because I thought that his Impale should proc all 3 instantly. I don't see why it only procs 1. And afterwards, I made it to where each individual stack deals damage. I nerfed how much damage it deals overall at 3 stacks, but now each individual stack will deal some damage. Before it did 5 to 9% based on level, but now it deals 1 to 2.5% per stack, which gets to be a maximum of 3 to 7.5%, so it is lower. However, I also gave it an ability power scaling. At maximum stacks, this is going to be 1.5% per 100 AP. So now AP Skarner looks better, because now you have an AP ratio on your W and your passive. And because each individual stack will now deal damage, it means that an item like Faded Ashes can do a bit more damage, and it means that if you upgrade it into Liandry, it's gonna deal even more percent health damage. So now already AP Skarner looks way more viable. On top of the fact that now his W also gives a passive stack. So I think this could be a very good addition. But these aren't the only things I added to his passive. I also thought that maybe he should get a bonus when he actually reaches maximum stacks on a champion or large monster. And in this situation, I thought he should gain some movement speed, between 1 to 4%, and it would be dependent on his level. At level 1 it's 1%, at level 5 it's 2%, at level 9 it's 3%, and at level 13 it is 4%. This last thing about the movement speed might be a bit much, but you will see afterwards on his E that I took away some speed, on top of some other things that I took away from his kit. So I think this isn't the end of the world if I add it here to his passive. Overall, it would make it to where Skarner could build way more things, simply due to the fact that now he has some AP ratios that can facilitate an AP Skarner build. Maybe you take Liandry and Bloodletter's Curse now, and that might be a setup for him. Now let's move on to his Q. I'm going to look at his Q in 2 different parts. The first part is gonna be the Shattered Earth, and the other one is gonna be the Upheaval part. Looking at the Shattered Earth effect, what I thought they could do is actually give some of the attack speed that Skarner gains on his Q passively. And then when he actually activates the Q, he gets double the attack speed. So he can have 10 to 20% passive attack speed, and then when he actually activates his Q, he gains between 20 to 40%. It's not that much that he would gain passively, but I feel like it would help out a lot. Saying this from experience, it does feel a little awkward that he doesn't gain a bit of extra attack speed. It's not some major buff, so I think it could be implemented. And then the other thing I added was to give his Q another AD ratio, specifically on the final attack. Right now, the final attack does a flat 8% max health damage. But what I did is nerf the early ranks and made it 4 to 8% based on level. But then I also added an AD ratio to that percent health damage. So it is going to be between 4 to 8% plus 3% per 100 bonus AD. And also the slow from the final hit has been reduced from 40% to 30%. And this would make AD Skarner even more viable. His Q already has an 80% bonus AD ratio per hit, so this is going to help him out very nicely. I don't think it's some insane amount, and it will make his early game weaker, because he will end up dealing only 4% on rank 1 as opposed to the full 8%. But it will scale better, and this might allow Skarner to go into his Bruiser variant more. And I would obviously also like it if the Spear of Shojin got stacked on each Q attack. An ability like Set Q, for example, stacks Spear of Shojin on both its auto attacks, so I don't see why Skarner Q wouldn't stack it at all. Now for the Upheaval part, I didn't actually change that much over here. All I'd really want to see here is have its range increased by just a bit, going from 1050 to 1100, and its speed on the missile going from 1600 to 1700. On top of another change where Skarner could actually move during the Upheaval cast time. Normally what happens is that Skarner stops when he actually throws his Q, but with this change he would actually be able to move during the cast time. I think it would just make it smoother in combat. Kind of like how they made it so that he can move during his W. When the rework first came out, you couldn't actually move during the W cast. So if you have this buff combined with the range and speed buff, it should allow him to hit Qs more reliably, and just allow him to outmaneuver the opponents a bit more. Now let's move on to his W. The first thing I did is actually lower its mana, which may seem weird because there was a time when Skarner would actually just do W max and do something like Scorch with Arcane Comet, Doran's Ring Start, and just permapoke. But you will see why in a bit, because I did some other changes as well. I also increased the cooldown early on up until the final rank. At rank 5, the cooldowns are exactly the same, but until rank 5, it is slightly longer on the adjusted version. And another thing I did is nerf the magic damage on the ability. I lowered its base damage by 10 and lowered the ability power by 10%. And this is just to make sure that there's not a toxic meta where Skarner just maxes W and perma spams it. And if he actually goes for that, it won't be as effective, because it will deal less damage. I also lowered the early game shield ratio, going from a flat 8% max health to 4 to 9% max health. So later on it's slightly stronger. And I also gave it an ability power ratio, and the AP ratio scaling is placed at 40%. I think that's a pretty fair amount. Looking at his ult W, it used to have an 80% AP ratio scaling, and the max health scaling started at 9% and ended at 13%. On top of that, I lowered the slow the W gives as well, going from a flat 20% to 10 to 20% based on rank. So Skarner loses a bit of utility there as well. And now with this added AP ratio on the W, it means that there is a chance for AP Skarner to thrive. You have the new passive AP ratio combined with the W shield AP ratio and damage AP ratio. So you could go for a W max playstyle, but it shouldn't be as toxic as it was before. Maybe the mana buff isn't needed, but the goal is to make sure that Skarner doesn't need to buy Tear of the Goddess every single game. Though again, maybe it's an incorrect buff, and I'm totally willing to admit that. So the cost could be the same or maybe even increased by a bit. I could see both of them being okay here, especially since I can't test any of the proposed changes. Now Skarner has access to a poke playstyle, at least for top lane. He can max that W and perma throw his Q, but because the rank 1 Q has less damage when you actually throw it, it means that if Skarner maxes W, his Q throw will also deal less damage. Maybe against certain ranged characters you just max W and perma poke and then tank up their damage with the shield. Perhaps you can do it into ranged characters like Vayne or Kennen, and that can actually give you a way to win out those particular lanes. And now, Skarner's E. This is the ability that I changed the most by far, and there's a lot of changes here. So I'm going to dissect it bit by bit and explain every single change. Starting off simple, the only things I adjusted in the beginning were the mana cost, making it go from 50 to 70 to 40 to 80, and then the cooldown going from 22 to 18 to 24 to 18. This is once again to try to make Skarner not buy tier early. The lower mana cost on E combined with the lower mana cost on W plus the actual base mana increase should mean Skarner does not need to buy tier every single time. But his E cost is increased later on just to make sure he can't spam it, because I did some other changes to the ability. And then I also upped the cooldown in the early game, just to make sure he has it less often. And now for the second part, and here there is a lot to explain, so I'm going to take it very slowly. First off, the amount of movement speed that Skarner gains. Right now he gains 100 movement speed roughly every 0.26 seconds, and it caps out at 950 total movement speed. On top of that, Skarner's movement speed when he actually casts his E will always go down to 150. When he starts the charge, he goes from 150 to 950 over the duration. No matter how much speed he has when he activates his E, he will always go down to that 150. So instead what I did is make it to where he actually keeps his current movement speed when he presses his E. And this is how Sion's ultimate works. Sion will retain the movement speed he gains when he ults, and it will ramp up to his maximum amount. And he will ramp up 15 movement speed every 0.1 seconds. In case you're wondering why I changed the tick rate at which it ramps up from 0.26 to 0.1, it's just to make it more consistent, and I also looked once again at Sion and saw that his tick rate update is 0.1 as well. So I just wanted to make it consistent for that. And I also changed the amount of movement speed that he can gain to 800 total. But he will not be able to get to that 800 movement speed at the beginning of the game. Let me explain what I mean by that. Skarner's E duration is 2.75 seconds. If he gains 15 movement speed every 0.1 seconds, it means that he can have 27.5 ticks happen within that ability time. But let's say 27 ticks because because the last one may or may not hit. It just depends on the server tick rate. So he will gain about 405 movement speed from his E. But if you combine the 405 with his base 340, that will not hit the total 800. It would only hit 745. And this is to make sure that at the higher ends, Skarner has the movement speed nerfed overall. Skarner would essentially need to start his E with 400 movement speed, and then he would get to that total of 800. But in the very beginning, he won't be able to ever reach that 800. Generally speaking, whenever you get out of a wall as Skarner and charge someone, you will already have about 750, maybe 850, or even the 950 move speed. If you try to charge through the large walls on top lane, you're basically always going to get to that 950 movement speed before you actually collide with the enemy champion. So in that scenario, it would be more of a nerf because you give the opponent more time to react to it, because you have less speed to charge into them. But when you're actually charging closer, it will be a buff because you start with more movement speed. But it won't be an insane buff, because the speed at which Skarner ramps up normally is actually quite high, to the point that if you're not going through the thinnest walls on the map, you will basically always charge someone with at least 650 movement speed by the time you actually reach them. But the change should make the ability feel smoother, because now if you're running around with 500 movement speed, let's say, and then you instantly press your E, you won't instantly go back to that 150 movement speed when you press that E, so you will still retain the 500, and you will just ramp up to the 800 total. But the 800 is less than the total 950. So at the higher ends, you will never be able to get to that 950 speed. This also means that because you make it like Scion's ultimate, where it takes into account your current movement speed when you press the ability, if you are actually slowed before you press the ability, and let's say you have 200 movement speed, you will start at 200 speed, and you will ramp from there. So you will be even slower. If a Nasus withers you and then you press your E, you will run slower. You won't just negate the effect, essentially. Right now, if Nasus withers you and you press your E, while you're in that E state, you don't care about the Nasus slow at all, because the movement speed you gain from the ability is fixed. No matter what the enemy does, you will always go from 150 to 950. But in this situation, if Nasus were to wither you, and then you press your E at 200 move speed, you will go from 200 to 605. So there is more counterplay there if Skarner gets tagged with any kind of slow. Maybe they have a brand with Riot on the enemy team, and then he manages to tag Skarner with an ability. And then Skarner has that Riot slow and he has to wait it out. Or he charges in with way less speed. But this also means that if Skarner activates Phase Rush and then charges with E, he won't just instantly go to 150, which should make the character feel better, while also giving some good counterplay here. There's also another speed stat that Skarner has on his E. When he actually charges into someone, he gains 300 bonus speed with a minimum of 650 speed and a maximum of 1150. That basically happens whenever Skarner is in melee range and instantly charges into someone with his E. He will just go to that minimum 650, or the full charge will make it go to 1150. And I changed this as well. I made the bonus movement speed only be 200 and made the minimum movement speed at 540 and the maximum at 1000. Honestly, the maximum won't matter as much in most cases, because when you actually collide with someone at that 1000 move speed, it doesn't really matter if it's 1k or 1.1k, but going from 650 to 540 on the minimum amount may help out a lot, because in top lane what Skarner will do is press his E in melee range and then try to loop someone around to get them into the turret, and then maybe lining up his ultimate to get them even further. So if he has less movement speed when he actually does the turnaround, it means he shouldn't be able to cover that much distance. So for now, the ability is mostly nerfed, only really getting a buff to make it feel smoother for the Skarner player, and in certain cases where you have a lot of movement speed, like when you have Phase Rush on. I also made Skarner's E deal physical damage when he actually connects with someone. Right now it only does damage when you hit a wall, but I made it to where he does some damage when he actually first connects with someone. This won't really matter in a gank because usually you're just gonna stun up the person, but on top lane it will make it to where if you can't actually get someone into a wall, you will still deal some damage. And now to get to some really important changes. The really big thing I did is make his stun be dependent on the channel time of his E. Sion's ultimate has the same effect. If you use Sion's ultimate in melee range, it will stun for less time than if it were to be full charged. So if Skarner starts up in melee range and insta-pins someone, he is going to stun up that person for way less. The stun duration is between 0.55 to 1.1. So Skarners that just try to cheese on top lane where they just pull people under turret will have a much tougher time doing that, because you have to pin someone to the wall and then instantly ult to make sure they can't escape, because the stun duration is so lowered in that minimum channel time. But the maximum channel time will still be the same. So in a gank, it's not going to affect him as much, unless you go through a short wall and then you don't have a lot of channel time on it. And then it will stun for even less, which will make it less reliable. So this would hit top lane Skarner more than jungle Skarner, but it does overall make his utility less powerful and less reliable.
But I'm not done yet.
Right now, when Skarner successfully pins someone to a wall, he will reduce his E cooldown by 35%. And I changed that as well. I made it go from 35% flat to 10 to 50% based on ability rank. So at rank 1, 10, rank 2, 20, so on until rank 5 with 50%, which again will hit his early game reliability. In the mid game, if he doesn't actually max his E second now, the refund won't be as high at all. But if he actually puts points in his E, then he will have the Ishtal's impact cooldown reduction be higher. But then if he does that, it means his W will lose on that health, because remember, I nerfed the health ratio on the W from 8% flat to 4 to 9% based on rank. So if he wants to max E second, then he will take a hit to his tankiness. And then the final change I did is change the actual damage of the E. I lowered the base damage from it. Obviously, you first have the physical damage portion of just grabbing someone, where the health ratio is nerfed significantly, but I also added an AD ratio, and then the total physical damage is just double of that, because you do the first physical damage instance and then you do it again, a lot like Poppy's E. And the total physical damage will have a scaling of 3.5% max health as opposed to the 6%, but it will have a 50% bonus AD scaling as well. And this allows Bruiser Skarner to thrive even more. You have the QAD ratio added to the final hit, plus this bonus AD ratio on his E. And this may give rise to a Bruiser variant of Skarner with a bunch of haste that wants to fight in melee range a lot. Let's say you max your Q into E and you are level 13. Your items are going to be Black Cleaver and Spear of Shojin with Ionian Boots. Your E cooldown will be a little under 12 seconds, and when you pin someone to a wall, it is going to be a little under 6 seconds. But for you to get to that point, you have to buy that Spear of Shojin and that Black Cleaver for the haste and even the Ionian Boots, and you have to forego the W max second, so your tankiness will be lower, but your actual 1v1 dueling power will be higher because you will get a higher refund on the ability. The idea is that you want to turn Skarner into a bruiser, so you will use the E for the damage more than the actual stun duration, and that would allow you to 1v1 people in melee range. And the 0.55 really isn't that high when you think about it right in melee. To put that into perspective, Volibear's Q stun is 1 second, and Poppy's E charge stun is between 1.6 to 2 seconds depending on rank. There is one more mechanic I want to talk about that involves Skarner's E. Many people don't know about this, but if someone is CC immune during Skarner's E, he will deal the damage as if he stuns that person into a wall, and it will also refund part of the ability cooldown, as if it actually hit a wall. You can see on screen right now that I activate my Skarner E and hit the Mundo. He doesn't go to the wall, but I deal the ability damage and I refund part of the cooldown. I just wanted to go over it because it might be important in some matchups. For example, into Olaf, you can activate your E in his face even if he's ultied, which would make him CC immune, but you will deal both instances of damage and refund part of the E cooldown. And now for his ultimate. The first thing I did is hit its cooldown. I made it 10 seconds higher just so it's up a little bit less. And I also gave it back its displacement immunity, which may seem strange because that just straight up buffs the ability. They removed the displacement immunity, but I think he could still have it. And the reason I added the displacement immunity back is because I increased the cast time of the ability by a pretty significant amount. I made the cast time go from 0.65 to 0.85. It was never this high. When the rework first launched, if I remember correctly, it was 0.75, but now I increased it all the way up to 0.85. That is more than the windup of set W, so it should give people way more time to actually escape it. And if you combine this change with the fact that Skarner actually needs to get a lot of distance on his E in order to stun someone for the full duration, it means that at least for top lane, if he tries to do something like flash E and then instantly ult someone, it is not going to always be a guarantee, because the CC duration is going to be 0.55 and then the cast time of the ultimate is going to be 0.85. So there is a window for your enemy to actually flash away from it, for example, which should make that playstyle less viable. And as compensation, I gave it back the displacement immunity, which again, I think it's okay because the cast time has been increased by a significant amount. However, if the cast time is still not increased enough, I can see it going to a 0.90 or even 0.95. I think a full second is overkill though, and it would make it way too unreliable. And then I also lowered the bonus movement speed that Skarner gets on his ultimate. Right now he gains 40 bonus movement speed when he hits a champion, and I lowered it down to 30%. This was also due to the fact that his passive now would give him movement speed when it's fully stacked. So when he impales someone, he doesn't only get that 30% bonus movement speed, he would also get the movement speed from the passive. And if he impales 3 opponents in the late game, he basically gets the same movement speed that he had previously. And then I also reduced the base damage of the ability, lowered the ability power ratio by a bit, and added an extra bonus AD ratio, so that the ability does a significant amount of damage if you build either AD or AP. Or maybe you go mixed damage Skarner even. And those would be all the proposed changes. Again, I had way more ideas. Maybe I could have given his W armor and MR whenever he hits champions. Maybe I could have worked on his passive more. Maybe I could still adjust something within his ultimate or his Q. But I think these changes would shift his playstyle from being a CC and utility bot that is constantly pro play jailed, because you hit his E and ultimate, which are the main tools that pro players use, and then you shift the power into more damage and lower the CC timers. You could still play tank Skarner if you want, but it is not going to be as effective because he loses some health ratios, he loses some overall damage, some tankiness, and he would deal more damage if you actually bought AD or AP. But if you just relied on his base numbers, it's not really going to work. And I think this is the direction that the character should head in. They should not force Skarner to just be a tank. If they do decide to just stick with him as a tank, he's going to be in the same boat as Maokai for the rest of eternity. Maokai doesn't really do a whole lot of damage. Instead, he's just a disruptor that is really good at providing CC and utility, and anytime a playstyle arises where he's not just a utility bot, he becomes super dominant. And if you remember, there was a period in time when Maokai was super broken and just tossed saplings into brushes and easily take 30% of someone's health. So he had that going plus all the utility that he had on top of his kit, which made him super strong. But because I nerfed the utility side of things on Skarner, and I nerfed them by a significant amount, it would allow him to shine in other areas. I'm sorry to all the new Skarner mains who believe that he should be a tank and only a tank, but I think it's the incorrect course of action. And you may also think this affects his jungle clear by a significant amount as well. I did nerf some of his base damage and his early Q damage on the 3rd hit, so it might be slower. But the thing is, with these changes, people would also itemize differently and take different runes most likely. Right now, what you're seeing on screen is the most common setup that Skarner runs rune-wise. What if instead of this he ran a setup like this with Conqueror, or maybe a setup like this with Phase Rush, or maybe even a setup like this with Hail of Blades? The first thing he can do differently is run double adaptive force instead of double scaling health with ability haste essentially every time. And then what if on his first recall, instead of getting a giant's belt, he gets a pickaxe? Then he would be able to clear faster. Maybe his first clear gets affected a bit, but you also have to take into account the fact that I added some passive attack speed, which means that he will auto attack more, so he won't be as reliant on actually having to activate the Q in the clear, and I also buffed his base AD by a bit, so it might just be completely the same. Maybe it is going to be slower by a few seconds. He would definitely have a slower clear if he recalled and bought a Giant's belt as opposed to something like Pickaxe though, because his health scalings are lower, and he got a lot more AD scalings. But that could be an okay thing, because then you shift his build from being Heartsteel Unending Despair on jungle every time, to maybe being something like Trinity Force first, or maybe Black Cleaver, or Spear of Shojin. And then the second item may be something like a Styrax Gauge. Or it can still be a tank item, but the very first item can be something else. Or you can even do AP Skarner in the jungle. What if you recall and buy Faded Ashes? And then you will use the W burn. Plus his W would also give him a passive stack, and his passive would start dealing damage from the very first stack. So it's going to have a bit of a bonus there, even though it won't deal as much damage overall unless you're buying ability power. It would all have to be tested. And again, it would genuinely shift Skarner into a much healthier playstyle. Less CC timers overall, less reliability on his ult. Just from those two alone, he already isn't pro play jailed, I'd say. Because you remove what makes him so threatening in pro play. His Impale would be so much harder to set up. I could go even more super mega in depth, but I don't want to go even further into it. I think I've already talked more than enough, and I hope I got my points across well. And if you've reached the end of the video, I just want to say thank you. I actually had a lot of fun making this video. I really wish Skarner was better, and I really wish he had more build variety. If that were the case, I would actually consider playing him on top lane more, maybe even creating a guide for him. I would love for him to come back, but not with the frustrating playstyle of perma pulling people under turret, or just being a super broken character who can only provide that utility and CC. If you have other suggestions, please leave them in the comment section. I am actually going to check them out, and I would like to respond to you guys if you have questions. I'd love to start a discussion about it. And who knows, perhaps someone at Riot sees this and agrees with my takes. Maybe not, but one can hope. With all that being said, thank you all for joining me in this video. I hope you found the information useful, and I will see you in the next video, hopefully very soon.
Favored by the gods and awaited in the Hall of Bones.